Sir, I'm going to have to ask you and the child to leave. You're making the other guests uncomfortable, and honestly, this isn't really the place for you two. There's a fast food spot down the block that would be more your speed." He said it loudly enough that the milkshake stopped halfway to people's mouths. An old black man in a pressed Sunday suit, a suit that had been carefully saved for exactly this day, stood at the gleaming counter of the most famous soda fountain in town, holding the small hand of a little girl in a birthday dress with a ribbon in her hair. And the young manager in the crisp apron stepped in close and put a hand up near the old man's shoulder, herding him, the way you herd something that has wandered in where it does not belong. And the old man did not raise his voice. He looked down at his granddaughter, whose big eyes had gone wide and wet and confused. And then he looked back at the manager and he said very quietly, "I've been waiting 60 years to buy a milkshake at this counter. I believe I can wait a few more minutes. Have you ever had to stand perfectly still and keep your face calm while a stranger shamed you in front of a child who thinks you hung the moon? Have you ever been told to leave a place you had every right to be, a place that you, more than any other living soul in that room, had earned the right to sit down in? In 10 minutes, that little girl in the birthday dress was going to look up at the wall of that soda fountain, at an old black and white photograph hanging in a simple frame beside a small brass plaque. And she was going to lift her hand and point, and she was going to say, in a small, clear voice that cut through the whole room, "Grandpa, that's you." And every single person sitting at that counter was going to understand, all at once, that the old man the manager was trying to throw out into the street was the reason any of them were allowed to sit there at all. Stay with me. You are going to want to be at that counter when the little girl points at the wall. His name was Solomon Reed. He was 78 years old. And the little girl holding his hand was named Ruby, and she was turning 8 that very day, and there was nowhere on this earth Solomon Reed loved more than the small, warm hand inside his own. Let me take you back, because to understand why an old man in his good suit was standing at that counter, you have to understand a boy who once stood at the same counter and was not allowed to sit. Solomon Reed grew up 4 streets from Prentice's drugstore and soda fountain, in a town that in 1963 drew a very clear and very cruel line down the middle of itself. Prentice's had a long marble counter and a row of shining chrome stools, and the best chocolate milkshake in 3 counties. And every child in that town dreamed about those milkshakes. And half the children in that town were not permitted to sit down and drink one. There was a window at the side, around the alley, where colored customers could be handed a paper cup if the man behind the counter felt like it. But the stools, the marble, the cold, sweet air inside, those were not for boys like Solomon. He used to press his face to the glass and watch the white children spin on the stools with their milkshakes and their straws. And then he would walk home the long way so his mother would not see that he had been crying. His mother told him something in that house that he carried the rest of his life. She said, "Solomon, they can keep you off that stool today. But there is coming a day when a man's worth is not going to be decided by the color of the hand that reaches for the glass. And when that day comes, I want you to be the kind of man who helped it get here. Do not you dare grow bitter, baby. Bitter men build nothing. You build that day. Remember that." He spent his whole life building that day, and on the morning this story takes place, he had come to Prentice's to finally live in it. Because in the spring of 1963, when Solomon Reed was 16 years old, he did a thing that took more courage than most of us will ever be asked to find. He and 3 other young people, teenagers, walked into Prentice's, and they sat down on the shining chrome stools at the marble counter, and they asked politely to be served. It was called a sit-in, and it was one of the bravest and most dangerous things a young black person could do in that town, in that year. They knew what was coming. It came. They were screamed at. A man poured a milkshake, a whole cold milkshake, over Solomon's head while he sat there with his hands folded, staring straight ahead, refusing to move, refusing to shout, refusing to give them the anger they were hunting for. They were spat on. They were dragged off those stools by their collars and thrown out onto the sidewalk and arrested, 16 years old, for the crime of wanting to sit down and be served like anyone else. But a photographer was there that day, and he took a picture of a 16-year-old Solomon Reed sitting straight backed at that counter, milkshake dripping down his calm young face, his eyes forward, his dignity absolutely unbroken, while grown men raged around him. That photograph went out across the country. It became one of those images that make a comfortable nation finally look at what it is doing. And that photograph, and the courage of those 4 teenagers, is a great part of why within 2 years, the stools at Prentice's, and a great many stools like them, were finally open to every child in that town, of every color forever. Solomon Reed helped desegregate that lunch counter. He was one of the children who broke it open with nothing but the straightness of his own back. And for that, 60 years later, there was a framed photograph of him on the wall of Prentice's. 16 years old and dripping and magnificent, hanging beside a small brass plaque that honored the young people who sat down at that counter in 1963 and changed the town. His face was on the wall. His courage was the reason the place could hold its head up at all. But here is the thing about time and about people. The photograph on the wall had been there so long that most people walked past it without a glance. The teenagers in the picture had become old men and women or passed on. Prentice's had been sold and renovated and turned into a trendy retro spot with a new sign and a new menu and a new young manager who had been there all of 4 months and who had never once actually stopped to read the plaque beside the old photo on his own wall. He knew the place had history. He thought history was a marketing angle. He did not know the man in the photograph. He did not know that the man in the photograph was about to walk through his door, holding the hand of an 8-year-old girl. Solomon had lived a whole full life since that counter. He had married a woman named Mabel, and they had raised a daughter named Denise. And Solomon had spent 40 years as a plumber. A good and honest one, quiet, dependable, never bitter. Exactly the man his mother had told him to be. Mabel had passed some years back. And then, in the hardest blow of Solomon's long life, his daughter Denise had died too, far too young, leaving behind a little girl. And Solomon Reed, at an age when most men are being taken care of, had opened his arms and his home and taken in his granddaughter Ruby, and started all over again, raising a child alone, on a plumber's pension and a bottomless well of love. Ruby was his whole heart. She had her mother's laugh and her great-grandmother's stubborn chin, and she thought her grandfather was the strongest, kindest, most important man in the entire world. And she was right, though the world had never bothered to notice. Solomon had learned to braid hair off videos on the library computer, his big plumber's fingers clumsy at first, and then, over the months, gentle and sure. He went to every school play and sat in the front row. He learned which of her stuffed animals had to be arranged in which order or she could not sleep. He was 78 years old, and his knees ached, and he got up at 6 every morning to make her breakfast and pack her lunch with a little note inside, the way his own mother once had. And he never once, not for a single second, let Ruby feel that she was a burden or that his life had been anything but blessed by her arrival. Bitter men build nothing, his mother had told him. Solomon Reed had built, out of the wreckage of losing his wife and his daughter, a warm and steady and joyful home for one small girl, on nothing but a pension and love, and it was the finest thing he had ever made. And for Ruby's 8th birthday, she had asked for only one thing. She had heard somehow in the way children hear things about the famous milkshakes at the fancy soda fountain downtown, the one all her school friends talked about. And she'd asked her grandpa if just this once for her birthday, they could go and sit at the counter and she could have a real chocolate milkshake in a tall glass with a cherry on top. And Solomon Reed had gone very quiet when she asked, because Ruby did not know. She was too young to have been told yet about the counter and the stool and the milkshake poured over a 16-year-old's head. She did not know that the very place she was asking to go was the place her grandfather had bled for. the place he had been dragged out of, the place whose open door he had helped to build with his own broken 16-year-old dignity. And Solomon realized, sitting there with his granddaughter's hopeful face in front of him, that he had never once, in all the years since 1963, gone back and sat down at that counter as a free man and simply been served. He had helped open the door for the whole world and never quite walked through it himself. So he decided that he would. For Ruby's birthday, he would put on his good suit, and he would take his granddaughter downtown, and he would sit her down on one of those shining stools, and he would buy her the finest chocolate milkshake in that glorious place, and he would watch her drink it in the cold, sweet air that a boy like him had once only been allowed to press his face against through the glass. It was going to be the completion of a 60-year journey. It was going to be his Mother's Day, the one she promised him, the one he built. He pressed his suit the night before. He shined his shoes. He tied a ribbon in Ruby's hair that morning with his big plumber's hands, and the two of them rode the bus downtown, an old man and a little girl, going to keep a promise 60 years in the making. That is who walked into Prentice's that afternoon. Not a vagrant, not a man who could not afford a milkshake. A hero of that very building in his Sunday best, bringing his granddaughter to finally sit where he had been dragged from, on the happiest errand of his old age. The manager who met them was named Dalton Pierce. He was 35 years old, and he had managed the renovated Prentice's for 4 months, and he had a very particular idea of the clientele that fit the trendy brand he was building. And an old black man in a dated suit and a little black girl did not fit the picture in his head. He did not stop to check the picture in his head against the two people in front of him. Almost nobody ever does. That is the whole mechanism of the thing. He saw an old man he assumed could not afford his overpriced milkshakes, and a child he assumed would make noise, and he moved to remove the problem before it could settle onto his shining stools. "Can I help you find something?" he said in the tone that means the opposite. And Solomon said warmly that yes, it was his granddaughter's birthday, and they would like to sit at the counter, and she would like a chocolate milkshake, please. And Dalton glanced at the suit, and the little girl's second-hand dress, and the ribbon, and he made the calculation men like him make in half a second, and he decided these two did not belong on his marble. And he did not say no outright, because that would be too clear. He did the modern thing, the polite, cruel thing. He said, "The thing is, we're really more of a full-service establishment. There's a minimum per seat, and it gets pretty pricey. I just want to make sure that's not going to be a problem for you, because we do get folks who come in not realizing." He let it hang there, the insult wrapped in concern. "There's a fast food place down the block that does milkshakes too. Might be a better fit." Solomon Reed felt the whole thing land in him like a stone dropped down a very deep and very old well. He knew this feeling. He had known it at 16, at that same counter in his bones. His mother's voice came to him, "Do not you dare grow bitter." And he kept his face still, the way he had kept it still with a milkshake running down it 6 decades before, and he said quietly, "We can afford the milkshake. It's her birthday. We would just like to sit down. That's all. We would like to sit down." And little Ruby, who did not understand what was happening, but understood completely that something was wrong, that a grown man was being unkind to her grandpa on her birthday, pressed herself against Solomon's leg and looked up at Dalton with the wide, wounded eyes of a child, watching her hero be diminished. And that look on that little girl's face is the thing I want you to hold on to, because it is the cruelest part of this whole story. And it got worse because a crowd makes it worse. A couple of other customers glanced over, and Dalton felt watched, and being watched pushed him the wrong way, the way it does. His voice firmed up. "Sir, I've asked you nicely. I'm going to need the two of you to move along now. You're holding up my counter." And he actually put his hand on Solomon's shoulder to turn him, and Ruby, 8 years old on her birthday, started to cry. And here is the moment I think about the most. Not the photograph, not the plaque, this one. Because Solomon Reed looked down at his granddaughter crying on her birthday, and the ribbon he had tied in her hair that morning with such hope. and the 60-year journey he had come to complete collapsed inward. And for one terrible moment, the strongest man in that room was undone. Not by the insult to himself, he had survived far worse than this man could dream of, but by the sight of Ruby's tears. He had wanted to give her a perfect day. He had wanted her to see the counter, the glass, the cherry, the cold, sweet air. He had wanted, more than he had wanted anything in years, to sit his granddaughter down in the place he helped open and watch her be served like the queen she was. And instead, she was crying, and a man was pushing them toward the door, and Solomon thought, with a grief that had waited 60 years to find him here of all places, I could not even give her this. I opened this door for the whole world, and I could not walk my own grandbaby through it. His eyes filled, and he bent down, this proud old man, and he began to gather Ruby to leave, to take her out of that place, and away from the unkindness, to protect her the only way he had left, by removing them both from the room. He whispered, "Come on, baby. Come on, let's go home. Grandpa will make you a milkshake at home." And that was when Ruby, wiping her eyes, looking around the bright room one last time for something to hold on to, saw the photograph on the wall. It was hanging right there beside the counter. An old black and white picture in a plain frame. A boy sitting very straight at this very counter with something dripping down his face and his eyes forward and unafraid. And Ruby stopped crying and she went still, and she stared at it because she knew that face. She knew it the way you know your own grandfather's face, which she saw every single morning across the breakfast table. And she lifted her small hand and she pointed at the photograph on the wall. And in a small, clear, wondering voice that carried across the entire silenced room, she said, "Grandpa, that's you." Everything stopped. Dalton Pierce turned to look where the child was pointing. Half the counter turned to look. And there it was, the photograph that had hung on that wall for decades. The one nobody read the plaque beside anymore. A 16-year-old boy with a milkshake poured over his head, sitting straight-backed and magnificent at this counter in 1963, and beside it the small brass plaque, and Dalton Pierce's eyes went to the plaque, and he read it, really read it for the first time in 4 months, and the blood drained out of his face, because at that exact moment an old woman came out from the back. Her name was Miss Cora, and she was 80 years old, and she had worked at Prentice's since she was a girl of 16 herself, all the way back. And she was the only person left in that building who had actually been there on the day the photograph was taken. She had been a young server in 1963, too frightened to do anything but watch. And she had watched them pour that milkshake over that brave boy's head. And she had never in 60 years forgotten his face. She came out because of the commotion, and she looked at the old man in the good suit, standing by the door with a crying child. And her hand flew to her mouth, and she said a name she had not said out loud in 60 years. "Solomon," she whispered. "Solomon Reed." And she crossed that room as fast as her old legs would carry her, past the frozen manager, and she took Solomon Reed's hands in both of hers. And the tears were pouring down her face, and she turned to the whole room, and she said, in a voice shaking with 60 years of feeling, "Do you know who this is? Do you have any idea who you were just trying to throw out of here?" She pointed at the photograph. "That's him. That is the boy in that picture. This man sat down at this counter when they would have killed him for it. And he did not move, and he did not shout. And they poured a milkshake over his head, and he sat there like a king. And that is the reason that every single one of you can sit on these stools today." She was weeping now. "This man opened this door, and you just tried to shut it in his face on his grandbaby's birthday. The soda fountain was so silent you could hear the ice machine hum. That was when Walter Prentice came out. He was the grandson of the original owner, 60 years old, and he had inherited the place, and unlike his grandfather, he had spent his whole life ashamed of what his family's counter had once done, and proud of the young people who had forced it to change. He had hung that photograph himself. He revered the man in it. He had never met him, and now, Walter Prentice came out of his office and saw Solomon Reed standing by his door in a pressed suit with a crying grandchild, having just been told he did not belong. And Walter Prentice did something that no Prentice had ever done for Solomon Reed. He walked up to him, and in front of the whole room, he took off the manager's authority with a single look at Dalton. And then he turned to Solomon, and he bowed his head, and he said, "Mr. Reed, I have wanted to shake your hand my entire life. I'm so deeply sorry. Please, please, sir, come and sit down." They sat Solomon Reed and his granddaughter Ruby at the center of the marble counter, on the shining chrome stools in the cold, sweet air. And Walter Prentice himself, the owner, would let no one else do it. Made a chocolate milkshake with his own hands, the finest one that counter had ever produced. Tall glass, extra cherry, and he set it down in front of a beaming, tear-stained 8-year-old birthday girl. And then he made a second one, and he set it down in front of Solomon Reed, the man who had helped open that door and had never once walked through it. And he said, "Your milkshake, sir." 60 years late, on the house and on the house forever. Solomon Reed sat at the counter he had been dragged from as a boy, a free man at last, in the cold, sweet air. And he watched his granddaughter spin once on the shining stool and take her first sip of her birthday milkshake with a cherry on top. And her whole face lit up with pure 8-year-old joy, and something 60 years in the making finally came to rest in the old man's chest. He looked up at the photograph of the boy he had been, and then down at the little girl he was raising. The two of them joined across 60 years by a milkshake at a counter. And his mother's voice came to him one more time. There is coming a day. Well, here it was. He had built it, and he had lived to sit his grandbaby down inside it. The consequences arrived in the order such things do. Dalton Pierce did not finish his shift. Walter Prentice let him go before the milkshakes were even empty. And the video, because of course there was a video. 6 phones had caught the whole thing. The little girl pointing at the wall, the old waitress weeping. The owner making the milkshake by hand was everywhere by nightfall. And by the next morning, it had been watched more times than that town had residents 10 times over. The man who had tried to throw a civil rights hero out of the counter he integrated found that this is not a thing the world forgives quickly. But Walter Prentice did more than fire a manager. He closed the soda fountain for one day the following week, and he held a ceremony. And he brought back every living person who could be found from those 1963 sit-ins. And he unveiled a new, larger memorial at the front of the store. And at the center of it was that photograph of 16-year-old Solomon Reed, blown up large, sitting straight-backed and unbroken. And beneath it, in bronze, the whole story, so that no one would ever again walk past that counter without knowing exactly whose courage had opened it. And on the menu now, in permanent ink, there is a chocolate milkshake called Ruby's Extra Cherry, and beside it a line that reads, "For the little girl who recognized her grandfather." Ruby Reed is grown now, but she has told that story her whole life, the story of her 8th birthday, the day she watched a man try to throw her grandpa out of a room, and then watched the whole room learn who her grandpa was. She says it taught her at 8 years old the most important thing she knows, which is that the quiet old man, making her breakfast every morning, had once changed the world with nothing but the straightness of his own back, and that you never, ever know whose photograph is on the wall behind the person you are looking down on. Here is what stays with me about this one. Solomon Reed walked into that building carrying the ultimate proof of who he was, and it was not in his pocket or on a card. It was hanging on the wall 10 feet away the whole time. His face, his courage, his history framed on the very wall of the room where a man was telling him he did not belong. The proof could not possibly have been more present. And still, a young manager looked at an old black face and a child's second-hand dress and decided the entire story in half a second. And it took an 8-year-old girl who loved her grandfather enough to know his face anywhere, to point at the wall and make the whole room finally look. That is almost always how it works. Not with a mob, with a polite hand on a shoulder and a fast food place down the block, and a room full of comfortable people who feel that something is wrong and wait, each of them, for someone braver to go first. Only this time, the someone braver was 8 years old, and she went first by pointing at a photograph and saying, "Grandpa, that's you." In the end, I made Solomon and Ruby up, but I did not invent those 4 teenagers at the counter, or the milkshake poured over a straight young back, or the photographs that made a nation look. Real children, 16 and 17 years old, sat down on real stools and let the worst of the world break over them without breaking, so that the rest of us could one day sit down anywhere we liked. Some of them are old now. Some of them are gone. Almost none of them were ever thanked the way Solomon was thanked that day. A lot of you are sitting on a stool right now, in one way or another, that a child bled to open. And a lot of you have been in that soda fountain too, at the counter, watching the polite cruelty happen 10 feet away, feeling that it was wrong, waiting to see if anyone else would say something first. So let me ask you honestly, if you had been at that counter, watching a manager herd an old man and a crying little girl toward the door on her birthday, would you have looked back down at your milkshake? Or would you have been the one who stood up, and whose photograph is on the wall behind the person you walked past today without really seeing? Tell me below. I read every single one. And if this story moved you, share it with someone who opened a door they were once dragged out of. And remind them that the truth is patient, and that sometimes it takes a child pointing at a wall to make the whole room finally see the giant standing right in front of them.